Nudges sort of by definition are quite light touch and hopefully low cost to implement. And ideally, they are an intervention that can be really rapidly implemented or evaluated. So often it's a small tweak to an existing program or process that just gets a little bit of a different focus or format or process, so that you can really quickly see, does this change make a difference compared to what we used to do? And let me just talk through a couple of examples just to put some concreteness around this. These are not all health examples, but I think they're really good examples of the nudge approach. And the first one is a very different topic, very far away from South Africa, but a paper that just came out that we all really like on, these are court summons forms in New York City. So if you're arrested or stopped by the police for a small infraction, I think urinating in public is one of them, you get, the police officer writes you up and hands you a form that says that you need to appear in court a few days or a few weeks later, even for this minor infraction. And one of the problems with this is if you fail to show up for that court appearance, you have an open warrant for arrest. So a much bigger deal than the minor infraction you've just committed. And people were just missing these court dates. Very, very high proportion of people were handed these forms, didn't show up, then had an open arrest for a warrant for the arrest, which caused lots more problems. And the changes that they made to that process were quite straightforward changes to this summons form. This sounds like sort of a no-brainer, but they identified multiple problems with the existing form that made the fact that you had to show up for court not very obvious, the date and time and location where you had to go not very clear. Some of the really important information was on the back of the form. And so they just made some tweaks. They labeled the court, they labeled it as a court appearance ticket, not a summons, because people didn't know what that means. They moved, you have a little bit of real estate on a form where people are really going to be able to pay attention, and they moved that information to the top of the form. They said where you had to go, and they highlighted the consequences of what would happen if you missed that court appearance. They also, this was a multi-dimensional intervention. They also added just some really simple text reminders, SMS reminders. So if the person who committed the offense gave the police officer their cell phone number, their mobile number, they would receive a reminder, a text reminder. So very light touch. They just changed the forms and they put together a very easy to implement automatic text reminder system. And in a trial that they were able to run very quickly, because a lot of these summons are given out every day, they were able to drop the failure to report rates from 47% to just around 41%. And that avoided 23,000 warrants just during the trial period for that new summons form. And the text messaging was shown to drop another 7,800 of arrest warrants or failures to show up. So another drop in percentage, and they were able to test those separately. So just a great example of thinking through, where is this behavior falling short? Where are we sort of getting in the way of people doing a behavior they need to do? What's a simple theory-driven tweak to what we currently do? And then let's test that rapidly in the field and get a signal about whether it's working. And I think this has since been implemented wide scale in New York City. A second example actually was led by one of our participants today, Philip Smith, at the Desmond Tutu Foundation. And this goes back to some of the things we've just been talking about in breakout groups of like why people might not come in to test. And we were really interested working with Philip and his colleagues on the U equals U messaging, right? So how do we get this idea that there's this sort of good news of undetectable being untransmittable that doesn't seem to be in people's mental models of, that treatment is really different now, it's very effective, it's very easy, you can still lead your life. That's not a message that people are hearing when they're encouraged to test or when we're promoting adherence. So we worked with a human-centered design firm to talk with participants, people that we would want, or in the population group we'd want to test, and really teased out some key messages. It's hard to just say undetectable equals untransmissible. How do we translate that into an invitation to test by highlighting some of the key concepts? The pills are free, the pills are effective, people take them, people continue to lead their lives, they have a good sex life, they have a good social life. You don't have to fear this diagnosis the same way that you might have had to before. We also baked this into a really simple oral invitation. It was a 60-second script that some promoters could deliver and a little postcard that went along with it that they could take to the clinic to get tested. So we could see if who showed up based on getting this invitation versus a regular invitation. And we were able to test this with just 12 days in the field. We wanted a little bit more. We got shut down by COVID. But because this is a very common behavior, we could hand out a couple hundred of these invitations a day and quickly get a signal about what worked. And in this case, we had quite a boost in the proportion of men who received an invitation that had the U=U script. About 22% of them came to the 2-2 tester to get a test versus 13% in our standard of care. Really quick intervention, and leads us to some new ideas about a larger scale trial that we'd like to do. And the last example is from a project in Zambia that Nava Ashraf did several years ago, trying to promote use of female condoms, which were kind of a new product. People really weren't sure about them, didn't have existing trusted channels to distribute those. And because it was a new product, people needed it to be kind of promoted in a novel way. And their idea was to train hairstylists who are seeing women frequently to both provide information and be a seller. They could actually distribute and sell the condoms to their hairstyling clients. And they were interested in whether incentives, financial incentives would work, or some non-financial incentives. So there was a trial arm that got a big margin on all of their sales. They got to keep 90% of the sales, a group that got a smaller margin, they only kept 10% of the sales, and then a group that just got these stars, literally these stars to sort of put up in their hairstyling location that showed that they were sort of doing this pro-social good, that they were being a source of health, sexual reproductive health for their clients, and every pack that they sold, they got a star to put up, and then there was a group that got no incentive. One of the neat things about this study is that the stars, the non-financial incentive, the kind of social display of what you were doing, did better than the large or small financial incentives or people who were just sort of doing it for volunteer. So a great reminder, even though we're often interested in financial incentives, a really neat reminder that non-financial incentives can be persuasive as well. And again, this was a pretty quick, rapid RCT in the field with about 700 stylists to quickly get this quite important and scalable result. Hopefully that's given you some examples of what we mean by a nudge, sort of how they emerge, how we design them, and the ability to quickly trial them in the field. And I'll stop there. Happy to, let's see, we have maybe a couple minutes before we need to transition to Harsha if anyone has questions around the nudges or what we mean by a nudge.
So thank you, Allison. I'm Harsha Thirumurthy. I hope you can all see my screen here. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm really delighted by the kind of participation we've had so far. I want to make sure, apropos to what Allison just said, want to make sure we have ample time to take questions from you all and also provide answers. And so with that in mind, I'm going to try to run through relatively quickly what lies ahead and what our hopes are for this virtual workshop series that will be held starting today, but that will be held in January and February next year. And so with that in mind, you've heard a lot already about what we're trying to do in Indlela, build this community that's here today, that is interested in behavioral economics. But by and large, what we want to see at the end of the day is some action taking place on the ground that results in improved outcomes, or at least learning about what the potential for improvement in outcomes is. And so with that in mind, I just want to define once again what exactly we mean by a behavioral insight test, since we're calling this the Behavioral Insight Test virtual workshop series. There's kind of two defining characteristics, I would say. One is that these behavioral insight tests, similar to what Allison just laid out, these examples, we want to assess the potential for nudges or interventions that are of the inexpensive and light touch nature to improve HIV outcomes in South Africa. And that's goal number one. And the other goal is, by virtue of supporting these behavioral insight tests, we also hope that within your organizations, whether you're from a research institution or an implementing organization or government, that there's some capacity building or expertise that develops in-house on how behavioral economics insights might be used in programs. So that's kind of our medium-term goal as well. And just to elaborate a bit more on the behavioral insight tests, I'll be brief here because Allison, in a way, defined what a nudge is. By these behavioral insight tests, what we mean is that at the core of it is some type of insight that's being applied on the ground. And so the insight here is really an intervention, a nudge, a change in how the services are being delivered. And it's trying to influence either the behavior of patients or providers, and ultimately it's seeking to improve HIV outcomes, ideally along the HIV care cascade. And these interventions should have some type of motivation that comes from behavioral economics, behavioral science, broadly defined. Should emphasize that many of the interventions that have been done in South Africa when it comes to service delivery do have a motivation that comes from behavioral science, like bringing services closer to the community, for example. So this is a very broad umbrella of interventions. But at its core, we would like to see these interventions engage some behavioral economics principles. And these could be interventions like nudges that are easy to introduce in programs, easy to implement. They could also be what we call removing sludges or removing hassle factors that may be getting in the way of achieving better outcomes. So the test part is also important. I think one of the hallmarks of the behavioral economics approach or the nudge interventions is that there is a possibility for rapid learning. Can they improve outcomes? And so the idea here is to rely on short-term outcomes that can be easily measured. So what we're not looking to do is implement an intervention and see if 6 months later it improves viral suppression, increases viral suppression. What we'd rather see is you implement an intervention and in the next 3 months, do you see fewer missed appointments or less loss to follow-up? And so that would be a signal that we're moving towards the goal we want. Earlier in the cascade, it's easier to define the outcomes, like do you get tested? Do people come in for testing? People linked to care. We're being quite broad in our definition of what type of learning methodology is involved. The gold standard might be an experimental design. The studies that Allison reviewed featured that, but there are other alternatives as well. And I think because of the nature of the intervention, because of the rapid learning, we're also expecting that these would be low overall cost to implement. And so that's another important feature of these tests. And of course, it sort of goes without saying that Indlela is here both to provide the technical support through the workshop series and beyond, as well as funding, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the very end. And we would like to see dissemination quite broadly in this space. So the roadmap for what's ahead, just getting to the concrete substance of what the workshops. I believe you've all received calendar invitations for the 3 workshops next year. The first workshop is the 26th of January, and I want to just describe these workshops in the next few minutes. Here we're going to essentially try to really pin down the problem statement, kind of go through the exercise we did briefly, but in a more earlier, but to do it in a more careful and involved way. The second workshop is on the 9th of February, and the ideal here is to take those problem statements and think about what solutions might be applicable there to address the problem, and then to think about implementation and evaluation of this idea in the third workshop. And finally, coming out of those workshop series, we're hoping that for some of you, that there might be some kind of light bulb moment that happens in these 3 workshops that says, okay, well, we think we're ready to test a certain idea, but we also realize that organizations will move at different paces because there's all kinds of approvals and conversations that need to happen internally in your organizations as well. And possibly even some hands-on learning in the clinics or with patients. So ideally, we'd like to see some bit project proposals develop coming out of the workshop series. And that will be, again, with the funding, I'll mention that. The format of the workshops, these are 2-hour workshops. We've allocated, I think we wanted to make sure it wasn't too short a time to actually cover substantial ground. But also we realize there's a limit to how long people can be staring at a screen, even if it's a webinar and it's interactive. So a 2-hour workshop is what we have in mind here. We will start it off with what we're calling brief behavioral economics sessions. So I think the idea here is to give you more examples of both what has been done elsewhere, the kinds of nudges that Allison reviewed, as well as to illustrate a few more concepts in behavioral economics that might resonate with what you're observing in the ground. So in my breakout group, we talked about how financial stresses and other stresses in your life can affect your decision making. So we'll review some of the behavioral economics research that really gets into why and how that happens. And so we'll definitely want to make sure that these behavioral economics learning sessions are not extremely long, meaning we don't want to talk ourselves at you for too long. We'd rather have the breakout groups where we're actually focusing on the problems that your organizations are facing. So there's, as you know, there's about 30 participants in addition to the Indlela team members. We're representing many organizations. So we had to think about, like, how are we going to organize the breakout groups? Because there isn't kind of one Indlela person for every organization. So what we're going to do is try to organize the breakout groups by the major outcome of interest that your organization, if you're an implementing organization, is focused on or feels there's a priority, or if you're a researcher who's partnered with an implementer, what is the motivating challenge there. So we think this will be organized around testing, linkage, re-engagement, retention. We'll have to figure out a way to make sure that the breakout groups are evenly sized. And we'll have Indlela team members both moderate and support the kind of progression from workshop 1 to 3. So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail now about each of the workshops. I want to make sure we have time for questions. But one thing I just want to to put out there is that, we realize that the holidays are coming up, and this year more than others, I would say we all need a break, a much needed break later this month. But what we would love to see between now and the first workshop is perhaps some assessment within your organization about, well, what is the priority HIV outcome, or what are the top 1 or 2 priorities that you might want to initially focus on? So is it testing among young men, or is it continuity of care among postnatal women? And so that would be helpful to know coming into the first workshop. And also, it would be good, you probably already have this, but just to have some of those hypotheses for what are the problem statements, like why is behavior X not taking place, to come into the workshop with that. And we'll unpack some of the barriers collectively in the breakout groups, really try to get specific about the problem statements in the way we were trying to do in the breakout group earlier. And we'll think about the behavioral economics principles that'll apply there. And we'll, going into the second workshop, we'll hopefully have identified here's 1 or 2 problem statements for each organization that might be worth tackling in the next workshop. Okay, so just fast forwarding, workshop 2 will really focus on exploring what are the potential nudges and behavioral economic solutions, what might we try, what might be feasible. And we realize this is true for each of the workshops, that there's going to need to be some internal discussion in your organizations, as well as follow up with the Indlela team members post-workshop. And then finally, in the third workshop, we really want to see if it's possible to move towards an actual solution that you might think could be implemented, and then think about how it would be evaluated. So various methods for doing that evaluation. And then finally, when the third workshop is over, we'd like to have some clarity. We hope you all will have some clarity about what are the next steps. As I said, is it the case that a project is ready to go, and can we work on a proposal, or do we need to have more dialogue taking place so there can be continued engagement? Last slide before we move to questions. So you're probably wondering more about concretely how can Indlela support this. So the workshop series is clearly one way. But to see things happen coming out of the workshops, we hope that we can see behavioral insight tests starting to take shape. And we're here to support those types of projects. And that's really the main reason Indlela was, one of the main reasons Indlela was created. So we're planning to create like a very structured but simple proposal template that lays out, here's the behavioral challenge, the problem statement we're trying to address, here's the nudge or the intervention, and then here's how we think we'll evaluate it, and here's the outcomes we'll look at. So these are meant to be, as we said earlier, these are rapid, short projects that can be completed quickly, and so the proposals will also accordingly be relatively straightforward. We think the budget for these, the maximum amount that we have in mind right now is 50K. We've supported one already, and actually turns out it's much less expensive, in part because I think the key is that the intervention is something that's really built into what the program's already doing. You're changing the way something is done, for example. And also from the research perspective, there's a limited need for personnel, but that might be the bigger cost driver. And I think there's a lot of options for how you engage with Indlela, in terms of like, you can have an Indlela investigator who's a PI if your implementing organization feels you need that support, but we could also play a more supportive role. From the funding perspective, as well as from the overall funders perspective, as well as our desire to see this community take shape, we'll want to have some role to keep track of the progress in the projects. And we will, think basically the proposals, I think, can come in on a rolling basis, because we realize that organizations will move at different paces. But we're planning to rapidly make decisions if there's a concept that's promising. That's it from me. I realize I've shared a lot that you're probably both intrigued by as well as want to follow up on. So I'm going to pause to stop to take questions, and I'll just turn it over to Laura Schmucker, my colleague, to moderate. But we'll answer as many of them as we can. We'll take notes.